Hello, David.
Hi, Sean. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good.
So the miracles of technology have brought us together here. You're all the way in New York, and I am in Pasadena, California. Yeah. So welcome to Blogging Heads. I've done this before, but you haven't. So I can act as if everyone knows that I'm a theoretical physicist at Caltech and have a famous blog called Cosmic Variance. But you're a philosopher of science, which I think is a brand new thing for the Blogging Heads experience.
Well, that's nice to know.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I might be missing somebody. So why don't you tell us what, the question that my mom always asks me, and I'm not quite sure the answer to. So what is it you actually do?
Well, philosophers of science, broadly speaking, do a number of different things. I guess it's reasonable to divide the field into two main subfields. Or two main kinds of activity. One thing they do is try to give philosophical attention to general questions about what science is, about how science works, about whether or not and how claims that science makes to having a sort of privileged access to truth. One wants to assess those claims. One wants to understand what the arguments for those sorts of claims are. One wants to decide whether those arguments are correct or not, so on and so forth. So there is a branch of philosophy of science. This is a part of philosophy that's been around more or less since its beginnings, and very intensely so since the scientific revolution, and so on and so forth, where we have this ongoing project, this scientific project, that's enormously interesting, that's producing spectacular results. One wants to know how it works. One wants to know why it works so well. One wants to know what one ought to trust it about and what one ought to be skeptical about, and so on and so forth.
Rather than just accept all of our claims unconditionally, as you prefer?
One wants to know how things like explanation work. One wants to know what one means by a law of nature, all sorts of things like that. Then there's another part of philosophy of science, and this is the part that I've done more work in. And this is a part that's become particularly active in the last 30 years or so, although there have been various periods since the scientific revolution when it's also been particularly active, but it's having a resurgence in the last 30 years or so, where one takes an interest in the foundations, the logical foundations, the conceptual foundations, the philosophical foundations of particular scientific theories. And this is a particularly interesting activity in cases where the theories in question purport to be fundamental or comprehensive or something like that. That is, it's particularly interesting in relation to physical theories, fundamental physical theories, and especially so in connection with things like quantum mechanics, where there are, which has a lot of puzzling conceptual aspects, and so on and so forth. Recently, and I think this is the way this part of the field works when it's healthy, it's become more and more continuous with physics. That is,
yeah, I was going to say that even I'm writing papers these days, and I find myself, thinking, well, I can't say that. That sounds too much like I'm writing a philosophy paper.
Right, but that's. I think at moments when the field is healthy, and I think this is one of those moments, the activity becomes continuous with the kinds of work that physicists do, which is addressed to the foundations of their theories. So that in quantum mechanics, there's this foundational problem, the measurement problem, which is
cat and all that stuff.
Which is at the end of the day a scientific problem, but a scientific problem that involves all sorts of subtleties about just saying clearly, for example, what the problem is, and saying clearly what would count as a solution to the problem, and so on and so forth. And so these are areas where people with more philosophical sensitivity and philosophical sophistication have been able to be helpful. But at the moment, particularly in foundations of physics, people actually prefer to refer to the activity as foundations of physics rather than philosophy of physics, because there really is a continuum and a very intimate dialogue between people who are working on these kinds of questions in physics departments and people who are working on them in philosophy departments.
Yeah, and there's some kinds of problems within science, within physics in particular, that lend themselves to that kind of analysis better than others. And I like to say, and maybe you have other examples, but there are two areas in fundamental physics that I like to work on where I think that the philosophers understand what is going on better than the physicists do. And those are precisely the measurement problem in quantum mechanics and the arrow of time problem, which we'll probably be talking about.
Right. Well, I'm not sure there needs to be a competition, among the two fields as to which understands it better, but it's certainly an area where, as it were, learning to think in the way that philosophers do and learning to be careful about the sorts of things that philosophers are used to being careful about has been a help. There are many situations, I think, in physics where sort of obeying the dictates of a philosophical conscience, to be careful here, to be clear there, slow things down rather than help them. But there are fields, and I completely agree with the two you mentioned, they would be my two main choices as well, where it's really become obvious that we had better slow down, that we had better think more carefully than we're sometimes used to doing in physics about exactly what our words mean and so on and so forth, and where it's going to be helpful to adopt the kinds of anxieties, the kinds of worrying, the kinds of being careful that philosophers are used to doing.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me to see when you talk to physicists about these issues, they divide almost very cleanly into two camps in both cases, where one camp says, yes, this is really important, this is a big problem, and the other says, why are you wasting your time thinking about these things? You're never going to learn anything doing that.
Right.
But,
I think that's right. I think also there's something that I don't think it divides cleanly along these lines, but I think the probabilities of which camp you fall into have some correlation with your age. I think there's an older generation of physicists who learn to be very distrustful and very suspicious of philosophical worries as things that were going to slow them down, as things that were going to, get them lost in blind alleys and so on and so forth. And I think, in my experience, it's very often the case that there are younger physicists who just can't see what all the fuss is about, and if there's an interesting unanswered question, one ought to address it.
All right. So that's interesting that you say that, because I think that the standard stereotype among physicists is that after you get to be a certain age, you start working on the interpretation of quantum.
Oh, well, that's true. I mean, there was a fashion in the middle of the last century of sort of people, people, as it were, getting too old to do hard work. And deciding to don their smoking jacket and sit in the parlor and let their hair down a bit and speculate about foundations of quantum mechanics. That was
we don't like to talk about
that was a sad chapter in our intellectual history, I think. If a question is worth addressing, it's worth thinking hard about and being careful about.
Okay, we should also let the audience know that you have an alternative career as a movie star. You appeared, for those who don't know, in the movie What the Bleep Do We Know?
Alas, I did, yes.
You did, yes. And this was this weird, quasi-documentary, quasi-fictional movie that appeared, how many years ago? So like 10 years ago?
I must be, I think, 6 or 7 or 8, something like that.
6 or 7 or 8, but it was a movie about quantum mechanics.
Or so it claimed, yes.
It certainly talked about quantum mechanics a lot.
Yes.
But not to give away any spoilers, I hope, but at the end of the day, they're saying that what quantum mechanics teaches us is that by putting ourselves in the right mental state, we can change the world around us.
That's more or less that seems to be more or less an accurate description of the thesis of the movie.
And you don't agree?
No, I do not.
So tell us a little bit about how you came to know.
Well, I came to appear in that movie, I think, principally by being stupid. I was very, naive about matters of the media at that time. Probably a combination of being naive and excited about matters of the media. And I got a call from some people who said they were filming a documentary about frontiers of physics or something like that, and wanted to know if they could come and film me. And to be honest, I guess I adopted some sort of an attitude like, you get on TV first, you ask questions later.
What could go wrong, really?
And I didn't inquire very much about what was going on. There were a few phone calls setting up the logistics of the filming, and in some of those phone calls there was something about the way people said "Have a nice day" when they got off the phone that made me think there was something a little bit new agey going on. But I remember lying in bed the night before the interview and thinking the following thought, which, looking back on it now, is just breathtaking for its naivete. I remember thinking, well, what can happen? I mean, they can't make me say something I don't believe. And, of course, that's exactly what they can do by the magic of editing. Months after that, they filmed me, I guess, for about 4 hours in my office. Fairly shortly into that conversation, into the filming, it became clear that the thesis they were hoping to defend and hoping that I would endorse is the one you just described. And I spent about 4 hours patiently, carefully, like a good teacher, explaining why I thought they were mistaken.
Why they should really make a movie about the interesting questions.
Right, and explaining exactly where I thought their mistake had come from and what they had misunderstood about attempts to solve the measurement problem in quantum mechanics, and so on and so forth. And I remember at the end of the movie saying, well, I imagine I'm not going to end up being in this movie. And they said something like, nonsense,
you were great.
Dissent is refreshing, you were great, blah, blah, blah. Didn't hear from them for many months. And then heard from friends of mine on the West Coast where this movie started showing that there was a movie that I was talking in, and it looked as if I was saying incredibly stupid things. And indeed, when I got a hold of the movie, it turned out that there was one talking head saying quantum mechanics shows us that consciousness is the foundation of all being, and another talking head saying, and this entails that by, like you said, by putting yourself in the right mental state, you can physically rearrange your external environment. And a clip of me in the middle saying something like, these are interesting questions, which of course had been taken out of a completely different discussion. And
but one of your co-stars was a 40,000-year-old spirit.
Yes, that's. It was.
How many people get to say that?
It was. I didn't say that.
How many people get to say that they co-starred in a movie? With
I co-starred. Yes, I co-starred in. And it was quite an amazing business. I went through. I went through a lot of different reactions to this, ranging from "this is funny" to "this is not particularly funny." I heard a story from a friend of mine in Los Angeles who went to see the movie and saw an elementary school science teacher with her class in the movie, and that was extremely distressing.
That is tragic.
On the other hand, there was happily a good deal of press attention to the fact that certain people who appeared in this movie felt that they had been misrepresented. I guess I was the main one who felt I had been misrepresented. There was some opportunity to set things straight publicly. It's now the case that when I run into somebody on the street or when somebody sends me an email as a result of having seen this movie, they're more often than not aware of the fact that I have publicly worried that the science was being badly misrepresented. So, at the end of the day, I don't, it's hard to say whether there was more harm, net harm than good done by this whole episode. But it was a curious episode indeed.
Well, and a very similar thing happened recently with this Ben Stein's movie Expelled.
Right.
About intelligent design and how the some weird combination of Nazism and communism has conspired to promote Darwinism in academia and prohibit dissent.
Right.
And a couple of scientists, Richard Dawkins and P.Z. Myers, the well-known blogger, were interviewed for the movie under false pretenses, given a title for the movie, which was not the title they ended up using, and they had clips of them appearing in the movie. What do we do? And what should you have done? Do you think?
I think like I say, I was at a certain point. When I first saw the movie, I complained. They offered me. They said they were going to come out with a sequel. They offered me, a couple of minutes on this sequel they offered me to do another interview, which they wouldn't allow me to do the final edit for, but assured me they would let me have more of my say. There was a sequel where I'm speaking in a little bit less of a censored way. It's hard to say. The Dawkins case you mentioned sounds even more vicious than this one. There wasn't just a sort of touchy-feely New Age agenda. There was an aggressive, reactionary, politically cruel agenda that was going on there.
And it was pretty clearly deceitful.
And deceitful. I can't, in my own case, I made no aggressive attempts to find out what was going on. So I'm not in a position to say that these people actually lied to me. They didn't volunteer information, which they might well have imagined would have been disturbing to me. But it would be an exaggeration to say they were explicitly deceitful. And it was also true in the case of this movie that public pressure did result in their coming a little bit cleaner than they had been originally. It's a funny question, and like I say, the case of these two films are very different from one another. I guess in cases where people aren't being that vicious and that aggressive, there's something to be said for engaging whoever is willing to listen to you. It might be the case. I don't know how to quantify the totals. It might be the case in the case of the film that I was in that it ended up that more people than would otherwise have been aware of it knew that there was debate about this. Ended up knowing that these kinds of applications of science. That there are many responsible people who feel that these sorts of applications of science have nothing to do with what science is really telling us about the world, so on and so forth. I don't know how to come up with a general policy about this. I think you have to have good taste. I think you have to have good judgment. I don't think that the appropriate policy is to learn from these kinds of experiences, never to have anything to do with the popular media, never to be engaging people who are coming at this with a set of preconceptions that you consider to be mistaken or something like that. On the other hand, one can't allow oneself to be used in a way that really ends up doing harm.
Right, and it was a little bit different in your movie. You were portrayed in the movie as a sympathetic character.
That's correct.
An expert.
That's correct, and that was outrageous. I mean, that was just, the simple word for what that was lying.
Yes.
That's absolutely right. On the other hand, it turned out that the occasion of that kind of lying provided a platform from which a discussion could be opened, a platform from which they themselves were pressured to come a little cleaner in the subsequent movie that they made, so on and so forth. There'll be many cases in which that's not the case. There'll be many cases, and indeed it could easily have happened to me because I was very naive about this, in which one could have just been cynically manipulated in a way that does tons of harm with no redeeming good.
But you must also have had the experience as I have I was dragged to see what the Bleep Do We Know by friends who thought that I was being a little bit closed-minded about what quantum mechanics is really about, because I'm a physicist and so forth. People really want to believe that what quantum mechanics says is that by putting yourself in the right frame of mind, you can alter the reality around you. And you try to explain to them that actually there's some equations and we've tested them and that's not what they say. They're reluctant to believe that.
Right.
I wonder if we could ever, if it's even possible in principle to imagine a movie, could we do for quantum mechanics or for evolution what Al Gore did in his movie? He made a very successful movie which was basically a PowerPoint presentation.
Right.
I wonder if you could make a catchy movie that got it right about something deep about science.
That's really interesting. That's a good question. I mean, it is, and the Gore movie is a good example. It's how shall I put this? The difficulty, what I told a lot of the people that I spoke to about this movie after the fact, what I told a lot of the press and so on and so forth, is look, aside from the fact that almost all of the specific claims stated as facts in the movie are false, there's a larger issue here. Okay, there are two very distinct ways of coming at the world. There's a way of coming at the world with the precondition that what you're going to find at the bottom of it is some flattering, reassuring, comfortable image of who you are. And there's a way of coming at it without such preconditions and with some kind of authentic curiosity and wonder and with some kind of authentic commitment to the truth and with some kind of authentic commitment to learn by looking at what's there rather than by consulting what you want to be true. And it's the second project that's the scientific project. And it's the second project that's interesting and exciting to me. And the first project, it's not just that it's getting the specific facts wrong. It's that it has nothing to do with the scientific project as I understand it at all. Not just in terms of the specifics, but in terms of the entire way of comporting oneself towards the world.
Or hopefully of the academic or scholarly project, right?
Say it again?
Or hopefully the same holds true of the academic or
scholarly
project.
No, that's correct. That's right. That's
the Enlightenment idea.
And this is, and so it's, how shall I say, a way of portraying that genuinely is in some sense not going to be able to avoid being disturbing somehow, not going to be able to avoid depriving yourself of reassurances that you want. I think that can be made exciting. I think that can be made interesting. I think, and Gore's movie is sort of an example of that. I agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be done, I guess.
So you're saying
do it very carefully.
If it's not disturbing, then you're not doing it right.
That's right. That's exactly right.
That's exactly right.
That's exactly right. I think it's a sad business, not just in this New Age business and so on and so forth. There's this whole project in the culture of sort of assimilating what we're learning about science to things that we think we already knew, from Buddhism, from this, from that. If you suspected anything like that, what's the point of doing the science in the first place? Okay, it's precisely what's exciting about the scientific project that it is an utterly different kind of epistemic project than any other such project in the culture, any other project that we've engaged in before. So let me just jump in for a second, vis-a-vis, say, the question of string theory. My understanding of the history of string theory is that among the important reasons why it came to be taken seriously in the first place is that it made a very natural space. Indeed, it made something on the order of inevitable the phenomenon of gravitation. I don't understand why this isn't considered by people like Horgan a spectacular predictive success of string theory.
You do have to figure out what you mean by predictive.
If the answer is that this is an empirical phenomenon that was known before, historically, before speculations about string theory, so what? I just don't get it. That's a spectacular predictive success.
Yeah, I think that you're right. String theory has a prehistory where it was trying to be a theory of the strong interactions in particle physics, and that didn't work because they kept predicting gravity. And at some point they said, oh, okay, gravity exists, so that's good. Let's make lemonade out of that.
That's exactly right. And vis-a-vis these other, there are, as you mentioned in your recent Scientific American article, look, there are. It's hard to think of a more vivid, ubiquitous, empirical feature of the way the world feels to us than the pronounced directionality of time.
Right.
The pronounced distinction between past and future. We don't have a scientifically satisfactory account of that yet. It's hard to imagine what somebody could mean by saying, well, all of the potential encounter between science and the empirical facts of our everyday experience have been exhausted. Okay. And just on one third one, this relates to the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. We don't have a good account as yet of how it comes to be the case that experiments have particular determinate outcomes. Okay, determinate as distinguished from deterministic. Okay,
right.
Nobody's looking for a definite way to predict what the outcomes are, but just for a theory that makes sense of the fact that these experiments have one outcome or another, rather than some superposition of them, whatever that means, when we carry them out. I can't imagine a more straightforward empirical fact of our experience than that.
Well, like you say, the idea of making sense, I think, should be important. If there's a fact about the world that exists, like gravity exists, or the early universe was different than the future universe, these are facts about the world that our current theories don't explain in anything like an interesting way, and therefore attempts to find at least one theory in which these facts are explained and they do make sense are, I think, intrinsically worthwhile.
I think it's absolutely right. I mean, it may be that the sort of thing that's actually in the back of people like John's minds is that there was this really interesting, important phenomenon, and so far in our history, it was a phenomenon mainly of the 20th century, of this enormous productive collision between science and technology. Okay, that before at least the late 19th century, these were more or less separate kinds of things. There was an abstract philosophical academic pursuit of physics, and there was a sort of engineering know-how kind of development of technology.
Actually, I don't think that's it in the case of either John or most of the critics of string theory or inflation or the multiverse or the anthropic principle. I think a lot of these people really are I think that their paradigm for how you do science is 1960s era particle physics, where it was not that there's some technological thing, but if you're Murray-Gell-Mann, you find a symmetry and you predict a new particle, and that particle is then sought after and found. If you're Steven Weinberg, you write a model for leptons, and it's the electroweak symmetry breaking by a Higgs mechanism, and you predict a W boson and a Z boson, and then you build a big experiment and you find them. And a lot of these people appeal to what I call, and maybe you can tell me whether or not this is an accurate use of terminology, sophomore level philosophy of science, where they say that, look, the demarcation problem between what is science and what is not science was figured out by Karl Popper a long time ago. If you can make a prediction that is in principle falsifiable, it's science. And if you can't, within 20 years, that's a little footnote that they sometimes add in, you have 20 years to make a prediction. If you haven't done it, then you should move on and declare it a failure. And there's a lot to say about Popper, and maybe we want to chat about that later in this session. But just aside from that, even if somebody were to grant everything you just said, this little addendum about the 20-year statute of limitations at the end is a bit awkward. Things may change over time, and the way in which science proceeds, even if it's always proceeding, as it were, as a project constrained by the empirical data, and a project whose aim is to give a satisfactory explanatory account of the empirical data, even if all that's kept constant, as indeed it should be. I don't know where the 20-year statute of limitations comes from. Things might get hard at certain junctures. Okay? Yes.
Nature might resist us more at some junctures than it does at other junctures. The world is complicated. The world is difficult. The world is subtle. The world is subtle both conceptually and in terms of the resistance it can sometimes give us to revealing empirical aspects of itself. And, it just, if there are long periods when science ceases to produce anything interesting along these lines, then it may be very reasonable of people to, during such periods, lose interest in it.
Yeah.
And then it's going to come back with more stuff. And yeah, it seems pretty silly and just inviting refutation in the most crass sort of way to say, if it doesn't satisfy these characteristics of, as you say, the way it was done in the 60s, it's not science.
Well, I try to say two things at once, and that's a little bit subtle, and it doesn't always come across. One is that when we talk about string theory, when we talk about the multiverse and so forth, it might very well be possible that tomorrow or 10 years from now or 100 years from now we figure out how to make testable predictions from this idea. And even if that weren't going to be true, I would still find it interesting to try to find a vision of the universe, a structure, a mathematical formalism that makes sense and fits the data we already have. Fits the fact that we have.
I don't understand. When you say makes sense, you mean makes sense of our empirical experience?
Well, I mean that, for example, right now some people would say, and this is, I think, a very minority viewpoint, but some people would say, look, who needs a quantum theory of gravity not just for engineering purposes, because we certainly don't need it there, but even in terms of understanding the world around us.
Right.
We have quantum mechanics, and it works in every experiment we've ever done. We have general relativity, which is not a quantum mechanical theory, but nevertheless, it works in every single regime
but
that
that's
gravity
good.
exists.
But the answer to the question of who needs this is whoever aspires to a scientific understanding of the world.
And that's just what I mean by make sense. I just mean that even if we have individual models which work in their empirical realms of application, if they're incompatible with each other in principle and they don't make sense, that doesn't satisfy me, and I would still want to keep thinking about it.
That's absolutely right. But I mean that's absolutely right. Although, look, if in cases like the one you're describing, say the tension between quantum mechanics and gravitation, because those don't fit together logically, we're also confident that that logical incompatibility could be parlayed into claims about how certain experiments would come out, perhaps very exotic ones, that conflict with one another.
Well,
I mean, it would be a quite different situation than it is. Okay, a situation that's indeed not easy for me to imagine. If we said we have a theory here that contains a logical contradiction in it. That is, we have this patchwork, okay? And some parts of the patchwork logically contradict other parts of the patchwork.
Like our current.
But we nonetheless have a theorem to the effect that any describable experiment, the outcome of any describable experiment whatsoever is correctly predicted by this patchwork. It's hard for me to imagine how a situation like that could exist.
Okay, but what about taking the devil's advocate position here now? What about if we had the converse of that? What if we had a theory, like string theory? Let's say that we develop our intellectual understanding of string theory to such a point where it can accommodate everything that we know about the real world. It can accommodate particle physics and quantum mechanics, also gravitation and cosmology and so forth.
Right.
But it also can accommodate lots of other things. I think that currently the state of string theory is that if I ask my string theory friends, can you imagine an experiment that we could do in principle, not just in practice, but give me a Planck scale accelerator stretching across the galaxy and so forth.
Right.
Can you imagine an experiment we could do that we would get an answer and you would say that answer is strictly incompatible with string theory? And at least some people have said no. They cannot imagine such an experiment right now because the theory just seems to fit. It seems to be malleable enough that it can accommodate all sorts of things, given our current understanding of it. So,
well, look, I don't. I mean. Frankly, I'm not sure what you mean. We have such an accelerator and we turn it on, and every time we turn it on, it turns into a hippopotamus. This isn't given a low probability by string theory?
Yes, that is true. But it is also,
I mean, here's a theory which accommodates everything. I can state it for you in one sentence.
Okay.
Everything always happens.
Yeah, I've heard that theory.
Okay. Our having this conversation right now is predicted with probability 1 by the theory I just described. My seeing what I'm seeing out the window is predicted with probability 1 by the theory I just described, so on and so forth. Okay. The only thing that's unsatisfactory about this theory is that everything else is predicted with probability 1 as well. Okay. So the theory doesn't have the feeling of being convincingly explanatory. Okay. Now, if you're really saying that in some way string theory is that theory, but I don't believe that's what you are saying. If string theory is really just a theory I stated, everything always happens, then it's not a very nice theory.
Right.
Okay. But I take it it's not like that. Okay. I take it has a special case for, say, exchanges of forces mediated by spin 2 particles, as opposed to particles of other spin. between masses, and so on and so forth.
Well, I think sadly or not, it's a little bit more subtle than that. I think that string theory has different manifestations. It's like, I like to say it's like different phases, as in, water can be ice or water vapor or water liquid.
Right.
Some people say different theories, but it's really all string theory appearing in different guises depending on what coupling constants you pick and so forth. And so if you know which phase you're in, then there's no question that you make predictions. You can be in 10-dimensional empty space, and then there are these strings that look like spin 2 particles, and it's gravity and so forth, and you make very, very explicit sets of predictions. Right. On the other hand, there's another phase of string theory that looks like 4-dimensional space-time without gravity at all, without spin 2 particles.
But that's okay. No, but I don't see a problem with that. And presumably classical mechanics is going to predict that there are certain regions of phase space where all kinds of goofy things are going to happen, or not even goofy things, but things of a very different kind than we're used to in our everyday experience. And part of our account of why things on Earth look the way they do is because of the region of the phase space of the theory that our circumstances stick us into. I don't see that as a problem. But is that going to somehow vanish at the Planck length? I mean, is it? Let the theory have all these phases. Yeah. Still, I describe, as long as the theory has an explicit formulation, or let me not put this as a statement, but ask it as a question. Is it really the case that for the sort of experiment you just described, the theory fails to make any prediction, or is it that there are parameters one could very easily vary without changing the structure of the theory, such as to run you across a spectrum of a variety of very different predictions, or what?
Yeah, I think we should probably get a real string theorist in here on the show at some point. Okay. Maybe Brian Green, who is your collaborator now, right?
Right.
We should drag him on here. But I think basically, I think that I'm agreeing with you, which is why I'm finding it hard to say something substantial.
Okay.
I think that it's just that our understanding of string theory isn't there yet. And there's this theory that we want to have that we don't yet have. What we do have is certain little specific sub-theories of it. We know how it behaves under certain special circumstances.
Right.
And the reason why it's hard to make a prediction is because we don't know which circumstances we're in, and therefore it's hard to say something definitive.
But that's reasonable enough. That's called. That's called being in the middle as opposed to the end of inquiry.
Yeah,
that's okay.
I think so. So this is a good segue about making predictions, because I want to talk about the arrow of time a little bit. And I got in a little bit of trouble the couple weeks ago because I gave a talk at the American Astronomical Society's semi-annual meeting in, well, I don't know, is semi-annual once every 2 years or once every 6 months? The meeting they have once every 6 months.
That's too abstruse for this conversation.
I know, it's very technical. Anyway, they have a meeting once every winter and once every summer. I gave a talk on the arrow of time. I think that, as you say, and as I say in this Scientific American article, there's a blatant fact about the universe that we don't understand yet.
Right.
And I would also argue, following you and other people, that it's a fact attributable to cosmology. And so I thought it was good to talk about this to an audience of astronomers, but because they are astronomers, at the end they want to know, is there a prediction? How do you test this theory? And I said, of course, I don't know how to test the theory that I talked about, but I want to emphasize that someday it might lead to predictions. And I dragged out a couple of examples of predictions or models that have been recently discussed in which something that happened before what we think of as the Big Bang would leave some sort of remnant in our observable universe.
Right.
And one of these was a paper that I just wrote myself with my collaborators Adrian Erichek and Mark Hamiankowski, saying that if there was a period before inflation where the universe was tilted in some way, where the universe had some stretchiness that was different in one edge than the other, then not only could it in principle leave an imprint on large-scale structures and the relic radiation from the Big Bang, But there have been claims we've detected these things already.
Right. I saw that article, and I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, I think, I think there are two fascinating things. We did write an interesting paper. I like to think, it may not be right or wrong, but certainly attacking this idea that in the data there is this thing that is not a prediction of vanilla conventional inflationary cosmology and might be a hint of what happened before inflation is interesting. And I hung it out there as an example of how maybe someday, if we understood the multiverse better and what happened before the Big Bang, we would be making very explicit, testable predictions. So those two statements sort of got garbled together, and it appeared in some of the popular press as saying that our theory of the microwave background said something interesting about the arrow of time, which is not quite accurate. But I think that the underlying question is very important about what should cosmologists be thinking about in terms of this blatant fact about the universe, the fact that I can remember yesterday and I can't remember tomorrow.
Right.
And you, of course, have written the book on this.
I have.
So is my formulation that the arrow of time, the fact that entropy increases, the fact that yesterday is different than tomorrow, the fact that I can break an egg and make an omelet but not turn omelets into eggs, is it okay for me to give talks and say that we can blame this on the Big Bang?
Well, I certainly think it's okay and appropriate to give talks in which one says there are good reasons to suspect that we can blame this on the Big Bang. I mean, there's a couple of things that maybe it's worth saying in just setting up this discussion. One is it's worth separating, at least at the beginning of such a conversation, several distinct arrows of time.
Sure.
Maybe it's worth focusing on three. One,
how many do you have?
What's that?
How many can you rattle off? It's a challenge.
Well, let me talk about. I think it's worth separating it into three.
Okay.
I can rattle off a lot, I think.
Okay.
But I think there are three main categories that it's worth that encompass a lot of this. Okay. One is what you might call the time asymmetry of sort of ordinary, prosaic, straightforwardly physical processes. Like you said, an egg breaking doesn't unbreak. You put your milk in the coffee, it dissolves. It never undissolves and jumps back out of the coffee. Ice melts in warm rooms rather than refreezing in warm rooms, so on and so forth. All of these phenomena are very convincingly subsumable under the second law of thermodynamics, under the law of the increase of entropy. Mm-hmm. Then there's another category of asymmetries between future and past, what you might call epistemic asymmetries, or asymmetries of epistemic access between past and future. And those are roughly that the kinds of things that we take it we can confidently know about the past are very different from the kinds of things that we take it we can confidently know about the future. And the methods whereby we obtain information about the past, like remembering or recording or something like that, are very, very different from the methods by which we can obtain reliable information about the future. Third category. We walk around in the world very, very deeply convinced of something crudely like the following claim, that by acting now, we can affect the future but not the past, that there's no point in crying over spilled milk, so on and so forth. Good. These are, on the face of it, very distinct asymmetries from one another. There's a long history of speculation about how these various different asymmetries might be related to one another. There were a lot of attempts to say, if we explain the thermodynamic asymmetry, we have also explained the asymmetry of epistemic access and the asymmetry of causation, so on and so forth. I think most of those attempts to link them together are a bit too quick and a bit too facile, although although I think at a deep level they are very much linked together, and so on and so forth. But anyway,
do you think that? I mean, I certainly link them together all the time, while acknowledging that if you put my back against the wall, I couldn't prove it to you. But I tend to go around speaking and thinking as if we understood entropy and the second law of thermodynamics. We would also understand the asymmetry of epistemic access to the past and the future, and the asymmetry of causality. Do you suspect?
Look, that can mean. I think that's true. That if we that if we understood one of those well, we'd understand all of them. But that can mask a lot of complications.
Yes.
The truth of that statement can. I mean, for example, here's something I often hear people say. I hear people say, well, obviously, the asymmetry in our epistemic access follows from the second law of thermodynamics because the formation of a memory is a process during which entropy increases.
I have heard that.
Okay? That seems to me a completely silly argument. Here's an argument of
Stephen
exactly
Hawking
the
says
same
that, by
form.
the way.
What's that?
I've heard Stephen Hawking say exactly those words.
Is that right?
I think it's in The Brief History of Time, yeah.
He's being very silly. Look, here's an argument with exactly the same logical form.
Okay.
Imagine a billiard ball moving to the right.
Right.
Okay. A billiard ball moving to the right is an entropy increasing process. That is, it's a real billiard ball made of molecules and so on and so forth.
Making small sounds, there's friction, etc.
Or just there are temperature differences inside the billiard ball as it's moving to the right. Okay, and it's equilibrating. Okay? A billiard ball moving to the right, then, like every other macroscopic process in the world, is an entropy increasing process. Therefore, it follows that billiard balls can't move towards the left. That's silly. Okay? The error in the argument is that although, of course, it's true that a billiard ball moving towards the right is an entropy increasing process, there's nothing about the rightwardness of its motion that's necessarily linked to the entropy increase.
Yes.
Okay? And merely observing that the formation of a memory, like a billiard ball moving to the right or like any other macroscopic process, is an entropy increasing process, doesn't do anything to eliminate the possibility of the formation of a memory of the past. Of the future, which would also presumably be an entropy increasing process. Just like a billiard ball moving to the left is also an entropy increasing process.
So the thing that I like to say, which you can tell me whether this is more or less sensible, the way that I say it is that the reason that we are allowed to make memories of the past is that we assume or presume that the past had a low entropy. And because there was a low entropy in the past, we can create memories. If we were in thermal equilibrium, we just couldn't do it.
Let's see. I think that's closer to the truth.
That's what
I'm not sure what to say. I think that's more sensible than the claim you're attributing to Hawking. But it still leaves me a little unclear as to exactly what the structure of the explanation is. Of course, if we were in equilibrium, nothing's going to happen. Okay, that's more or less the definition of equilibrium. You're not going to form memories. You're also not going to, nothing's going to be happening in equilibrium.
Yeah.
Yes, so it's a safe bet that among the things that aren't going to be happening in equilibrium are the formation of memories. Okay. Yes, memories can only form out of equilibrium. I'm still not sure how that explains why the memories that form out of equilibrium are necessarily of the entropic past as opposed to of the entropic future.
Well, okay, let me put it this way. So what I like to believe is that a memory or memories, when we talk about memories, it sort of messes, it adds some superstructure of consciousness in the brain that maybe...
So talk about a recording.
Yeah, talk about a recording. Good. So I have a recording or some photograph or some evidence of the condition of the world right now. And I take that to mean that if I have a photograph of what a building looks like, then there's a building that looks like that, up to the possibility that someone demolished it in the meantime and so forth. Mm-hmm. So I'm saying there's a correlation between this record I have and something about the external world. But, of course, in the space of all possible configurations of the degrees of freedom of the universe, there are many, many more configurations in which I have a photograph like that, and there's no building at all out there that resembles the photograph.
That's right.
And so the thing that lets me believe that this photograph is a reliable record of something outside is that I make a presumption about what the state of the universe was in the past, namely that there was no correlation between the photograph and the building outside. I should say that better. That the photograph itself was in a very specific state. The piece of film was in a very specific state that allowed it, when it interacted through the laws of physics with the building, to become a record of what the building was. And that requires that because the past had to be in a specific state, it had to be lower entropy.
Look, I'm not sure. I suppose I come back to my room.
Yeah.
I know I left my room in a mess, in a higher entropy state.
Right.
Okay? Yeah. I come back to my room, and it's all cleaned up and arranged.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like I have a record of somebody having come and entered my room and done stuff. But the record has been formed by lowering the entropy
of my room. Yes. Of your room.
I mean, I don't think I think. Look, I mean, we're sort of dancing around here. I think that we're inching towards something here that's going to be right. I mean, I don't think by any means. This is one of those occasions where the philosopher is just being pouty and insisting that the question be formulated and reformulated a little bit more clearly, so as to make it a little more clear, each time exactly what would count as an answer to the question, and so on and so forth. I think this is all going in the right direction, and I do think it's going to end up being the case, and a case that one can put in a very clear way, that the initial conditions of the universe that are necessary in order to guarantee the truth of the second law of thermodynamics, or the statistical truth of the second law of thermodynamics, turn out to be the same set of conditions that will suffice to guarantee the epistemic asymmetry, and the same set of conditions that will suffice to guarantee the causal asymmetry. I think they are all in there, okay? I think sometimes things get confused by a much too facile assimilation of these issues with one another.
Well,
but at the end of the day, I think the intuition that they're very deeply related to one another is 100% correct.
So I gave a colloquium about a year ago at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and I stood up there and I said, if you want to understand why entropy is increasing in the actual world in which we live, you cannot, as Boltzmann tried to do, start with time-symmetric laws of physics and make some very, very reasonable non-time asymmetric assumptions and derive a theorem that says it must be so.
Sure.
Instead, you have to understand something about the cosmological history of the universe. And one of the emeritus professors in the audience objected strongly and says that, when he teaches statistical mechanics, he never mentions cosmology, and this is crazy. And the next day, sent email to the entire physics department and copied me, saying that was the dumbest colloquium he had ever heard.
Wow.
I thought it was nice that he at least, copied me on the email.
Wow. Well, people who make their living talking about the measurement problem, like me, have had plenty of experiences like that.
He did actually say, as a parenthetical remark, except for the one a couple weeks ago about the interpretations of quantum mechanics. So he is at least consistent.
Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah.
I've been there. Yeah, that you know what the deal is. You have to be very philosophical about that. It really does just take time. Okay.
Right.
Where there are real questions. I mean, I've had a long enough career now to have lived through some of these episodes, to have been astounded by, I am both astounded by how long it takes for some of these things to sink in, and at the same time, sort of encouraged by the fact that if you give them long enough, which may be vastly longer than you expect it to be, eventually a problem that's a real problem announces itself to everybody as such. And you have to be very philosophical, and you have to calmly tell the truth as you understand it. And eventually these things get to be better understood. But it does take an astonishingly long time.
Well, we're running out of time a little bit here. So if you were to give advice to scientists, do you think that more scientists should be thinking about foundational issues like this, or do you think that we have a balance?
I think it's great for people to be doing what they're good at.
Yeah.
I certainly think. So, I think there's room for all kinds of very different activities within the scientific project, and I think it's people should go where their talents and their inclinations lead them. But surely, for the past at least half century in physics, although it's very much on the wane now, there was a positive, significant obstacle to people thinking about these sorts of problems. It involved putting one's career, putting one's livelihood at very palpable risk. This is surely something in the long run that's going to look to people who look back on us silly and self-destructive and counterproductive and defensive and small-minded and frightened. And that's just a bad place. That's just a bad place to be. My advice to scientists, I guess, is the same as any reasonable person's advice to scientists, which is you pursue what it looks like you have the best chance of making a good contribution to.
Yeah.
But it's surely a sad story that there was a very long period in the history of physics when the raising of certain sorts of perfectly intelligible questions was made into a taboo. It's an episode in the history of science which is precisely the sort of episode that the scientific spirit is supposed to be unique in terms of being immune from. And I think it's a very strange and sad and interesting story, a story which no historian has told well yet, and which somebody really needs to.
Well, and I think it's going to be undeniable that, I always find it interesting when we're working on things right now and are very excited about them that we could have been working on 50 years ago. The basis was there, and I think that... That's right.
And certainly something like the problem of the direction of time or the measurement problem are paradigmatic examples.
Well, in quantum mechanics, the arrow of time, as much as I love it, is not there yet as something that is respectable to think about. But for 50 years, quantum mechanics was something you used, not something you thought about.
No, that's right.
And now it's a broad field, just doing, basic small numbers of bits of quantum mechanical systems.
That's right.
Within physics,
that's right.
And people are getting hired at hotshot places.
No, that's right,
which is great.
And that's a very good thing. I came into the field well before that was the case. I came into the field 25 years ago. I got my PhD 26 years ago in physics, well before that was the case. And it was made very clear to people that they had better not direct their attentions that way because they were going to hurt themselves in a very straightforward, pragmatic, career-related sort of way. And it
was a probably true statement at the time.
Yeah. Oh, yes, it was.
And I always had mixed feelings when talking to students or postdocs or whatever. And a lot of people are passionate about something, and you don't want to say, don't work on that thing that you're passionate about because you won't get a job. But you also don't want to say, work on it because who cares if you get a job?
That's right.
I say, what I try to say, and this maybe is overly glib, but I hope it's true, that you should ask yourself, is there anything that is in the intersection of what you're passionate about and what might
Right.
someday get you a job?
Right.
And if the
Right.
answer is no, that they're empty, then you have a dilemma anyway.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And that's why they invented tenure, so that you can figure out these things and then move on.
That's right.
Or at
That's
least
right.
do it part-time. All right, so I think we've reached the end of our hour. We had a technical glitch there in the middle, but hopefully they'll be able to patch it together.
Okay.
It was great talking to you.
Same here, Sean.
And welcome to the Blogging Heads experience.
Well, thank you. Let's do it. You know, we never got to some of the stuff in your Scientific American article. There's tons more to talk about.
There's a lot more to talk about.
So let's do it again sometime.
I still want to get Karl Popper out there and dissect him a little bit.
And Popper, absolutely right. So there's tons more to talk about. It was a lot of fun. I'm sorry about the technical glitch on my end, but I'd love to do it sometime.
I think if we have a philosopher and a theoretical physicist, they manage to do this at all, it's kind of miraculous.
That's right.
They can't be.
They should be happy. That's right.
All right, David, take care.
Okay, Sean.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye. Nice to talk to you.